Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Discussing a Murderer, episode 28. With me today is the full panel. Usually we start from the top. We'll start from the bottom and say hello to Cal first. Hey, Cal, how you doing?
Good morning, everyone. It's 6:46 a.m. on a Thursday morning, and I am ready to start this podcast.
Well, we appreciate your dedication and your early rising for us, and we appreciate everybody. Big Jeff has stayed up through the winters with us when he's recorded late into the night, so we're all give a little bit, take a little, appreciate that, and everybody out in chat for making time. I'm sorry, Jack.
Doing good, and it's just opposite for me. It's almost dinner time, having bacon cheeseburger and onion rings for dinner. So I'm on the other end of that, away from breakfast. So, and I pretty woke up. Cal's waking up. Glad to be back, and hello everybody in the live chat. Hello to all my fellow panel members, and let's do it.
Well, hello to you too, Jack, and thank you so much for joining us and adding that nice comments. Dr. Silkman, how you doing? Nice to see you back.
It's great to be back. Thanks, Jeff. And I'd like to say a big hello to all my fellow panel members and everyone in chat. It's about 9:15 Thursday morning here in Adelaide, South Australia. So I'm probably in the future of most people, but yeah, it's great to be here. Let's get on with it.
You're absolutely in the future for me, and I'm the one who's the furthest behind it. I've said it before, I'll probably say it again, but just the fact that we've able to come to a schedule and get all of us here from different parts of the world on this platform at once is a feat in itself, and so we should all be happy, and I think all the panel members deserve a little pat on the back for that. With that said, let's say hello to Big Jeff. Hey, Big Jeff.
Hey, Jeff, how are you doing? I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be part of the worldwide panel, because that's really what this is. I've been in a really good mood the last couple of weeks in between our recordings. I haven't thought of that buffoon Ken Kratz once, but seeing his ugly mug in an icon in the image to the right is starting to sour my mood. So my bold prediction of the day is going to be, if Ken Kratz shows up, and he's going to get completely and totally eviscerated, either at my front door or within this podcast, either one.
Well, I think you're in for a treat then, my friend, because if memory serves, I think we get a healthy dose of Ken Kratz coming up.
Healthy, unhealthy, any amount of Ken Kratz.
Yeah, there is. Okay, point taken. You got me there, touche.
Looking back, were there certain things you would have done differently in this case, knowing now what you do?
Yeah, certainly. The one big thing I would have done is not give a press conference on the 2nd of March after Brendan made his statement and after he was charged. I provided that information that was in the criminal complaint orally. I could have and should have just released the complaint, let all the reporters repeat the facts. I didn't.
Well, a broken clock is still right 2 times a day. Isn't that right, Jeff?
Well, let me tell you something. Part of the problem with the March 2nd press conference, as everyone on the panel is well aware, was that it was filled with lies, right? Pools of blood is always what comes to mind when I think about the March 2nd press conference, the pools of blood in the RAV. Where were those pools of blood? Do we have any pictures of those, Jack?
We do not. Not one photo of any blood.
Pools. I mean, you'd step into the RAV and you'd have blood up to your knee. That's what a pool of blood sounds like to me.
At minimum, it'd be on your shoes. At minimum, right?
The tops, right? Not the bottom.
Absolutely.
A pool in a puddle. You know, if you said there was a puddle of blood, you'd be like, oh, there's a substantial amount. A pool of blood sounds like more, wouldn't you say?
I would. And the second thing is, you know, compared to the amount of information that's being released for the Idaho 4, right? The the prosecutors are very appropriately keeping what they have under wraps, as to not to potentially poison the jury pool. It's, as much as the public savors for information, it's not really of any of their business at this point, right? And things have to be kept under wraps to make the trial fair. Ken Kratz was not in that business, and releasing the details of the confession wouldn't, especially since they were, since he amplified them with lies, was completely not appropriate. Even the action that he just suggested, in my mind, is also inappropriate. So, he's just, look how happy he is that he's on the friggin' news, getting some press time, hawking his book. You know what? I almost wish we could fast forward to this guy, but I know we can't.
Look, I just want to echo what Big Jeff and Jack 61 said. If you honestly believe that Ken Kratz regretted doing the March 2nd press conference, to quote his words, are you smoking crack, right? There's absolutely no question in my mind or in anybody else's mind. Ken Kratz knew exactly what he was doing when he did the March 2nd press conference. He even said it in his book. He needed to counteract the sympathy that Stephen Avery had with the community. The fact that he was a recent exoneree, he had a civil suit going on, etc., etc. And he was the poster child, so to speak, for the Innocence Project. Ken Kratz had to counteract all of that. And he did it in the most brutal, disgusting, overt manner. The mere factor that he now comes on TV and does a press conference to say, well, I really regret doing that March 2nd press conference, it is complete, utter bullshit. He knew exactly what he was doing. He planned it. It was deliberate. And I agree with what Big Jeff and Jack 61 said. He had no evidence.
I just feel like every time I see them in the media, Ken Kratz or Fassbender, I always get this feeling like, in my mind, you have to remember that they're not doing this for anyone else except for themselves. Ken Kratz is in this chair right now for Ken Kratz. He's not in that chair for Teresa Halbach, for justice, for the family, for anything. He's in that chair sitting in front of that camera for Ken Kratz.
100%. And it also proves that he cannot walk away from this case. He wants to milk it for all it's worth.
Yeah, it's the same thing he really did at the trial. He created this persona around himself, and Teresa got forgotten. Stephen didn't, but this was Kratz's job to make sure that Teresa was in the forefront. And he would throw out her name from time and again, but his actions dictated that he would be the front guy. This would be about him and not really about Teresa. That's what I remember. That's what I remember seeing. And I get that same feeling every time I watch Making a Murder, every time.
Have to do that, and obviously,
If
I had to do it all over again, I was trying to keep more information out of the public. It sounds a little bit unusual, but there were so many horrific facts in this case that I thought by providing the soundbite myself, by providing the soundbite, I could lessen the impact on the family and on the community. I was resoundingly criticized for it. I see why.
The only reason why he's now feeling sorry is because of the tirade of abuse that he copped, but not only from the general public, also by Professor Gershman, right, who is a law professor with many, many years of experience. And he went through and highlighted exactly all the things that Mr. Kratz transgressed on. And certainly that March the 2nd press conference was extremely prejudicial to both Stephen and also for Brendan. How can anyone see them as being innocent when you've got all this salacious rubbish being thrown out to the general public without any fact checking, right? So you must understand, guys, there are no facts. The whole thing is just a made up story. And it's really disgusting that a prosecutor with his experience basically told a story on national TV. And that unfortunately affected everything.
That's right. Everything from that point forward was affected because he says he's got all these facts that he withheld. He didn't have anything. The only real fact he had was that he's up there talking to damage the jury pool. That was the real fact. And because, around this time, Strang was already part of the legal team because Stephen had gotten his money and he didn't qualify for a public defender anymore. And then Meeting joined, I can't remember what day, but it's real close to the day of the press conference because he was still tied up with the Armstrong case. So he knew he had two really gifted attorneys joining Avery, and he had to, I think he felt threatened, I think, and probably the entire, Fallon and Gone, they're like, we got to do something to push this off to a different direction. They didn't care about the truth. And I cannot believe that Kratz went out there and did what he did, and they didn't know what he was going to do. I can't believe that. I don't believe it.
Yeah, but when we talk about miscarriages of justice, right? I mean, first of all, look at the smirk on his face, right? He just got done telling the reporter how I actually performed a public service, right? We know as prosecutorial misconduct that he didn't face a lick of consequence for. Look at the freaking smirk on his face right there. He's like stopping himself from laughing at that point. This isn't funny what he did to two people, especially for poor Brendan, who he's been in prison his whole life. He's been in prison more years than he's been alive, right? Sorry, more time in prison than he spent out of prison, right?
Correct.
It's just horrific what he did. He's sitting there laughing about it. Look at that smirk on his face. I did a public service because he suppressed the horrific lies that were implanted into the story by Wiegert Fassbender. It's just my good mood is rapidly dissipating. That's all I have to say.
Oh, big Jeff.
But
this could get ugly today.
But another important point is that it was mainly all bullshit because they dropped several charges against Stephen Avery because they knew they could not prove it, right? However, the damage was done by releasing all this salacious information about rape, mutilation, etc., without any form of proof.
But I made that decision. It was a conscious decision that I made to do that again. I would have done it differently.
I think it was Steve Drizzen who actually put up the statute, the Wisconsin statute, about being extremely careful about making prejudicial remarks, right? There is a law against that. And Professor Gershman also pointed it out as well. So Mr. Kratz actually did transgress despite what he says.
I think what Jeff Jones ought to do is pen a letter to, Marquette Law School to ask if it's really appropriate based upon the understanding of some of their graduates of the law as to whether they really should not have to pass the Wisconsin bar, because it seems like at least this graduate seems to be wrong on so many counts that you wonder whether or not that's good policy. I think you ought to get right on that, Jeff.
I think you know where they'd file that letter. Just to...
It'll be so cathartic to just write that letter.
Well, that's true. Maybe it sounds like you kind of want to write that letter.
Would everyone on the panel and in chat agree that Mr. Kratz was wrong on the facts and wrong on the law?
Exactly.
Another probably lesser known thing about Kratz's press conference, you just kind of have to look, but even at this point in time, Avery was telling family members, hey, they set me up and blah, 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 this. And I think he had made some statements to the media. I don't remember which reporter it was or reporters. And there's a few, if you look up the publicity section in the Wisconsin SCR Supreme Court rulings, there is an exception. There is a chapter on publicity, and it's very clear. Prosecutors and really defense attorneys, but especially prosecutors under their code of conduct, are supposed to keep their mouths shut. But there are exceptions to that. And one of the exceptions was, I don't remember exactly how it's worded, but basically it's a defense of the state. It's worded really strange, as usual. And that makes it slippery, to allow these weird kind of damn things to happen. Because in reality, I think everyone would agree, Kratz should have been sanctioned for this press conference, and he should have been sanctioned hard. There are other things that he did too that told me that he had a green light. I mean, and that goes directly to the May 13th interrogation of Brendan, when he wanted the clean confession, and he knew that Brendan was represented, but Kaczynski says, it's okay. It's all right. No, dude, it's not okay. But he approved that interrogation. Kaczynski gets in trouble, in August. He gets his ass in a crack. Nothing happens to Kratz. And there has to be a head to the case, every case. And that is the prosecutor. It's his duty and role in the system to make sure that there's fairness, even in this, this arbitrary system that we have. So this son of a bitch, every time, I really wish we had the entire press conference. I probably would blow 4 or 5 gaskets and have to go see a therapist, but I really wish we had the entire thing. I think it would be gold.
6 months ago, after the Lynn thing had heated up, Stephen was very upset about just about everything. He was angry, he was nervous, he was overwhelmed. And this is when Stephen decided to take me off the visiting list. He was still calling me. We didn't fight anymore, but I ended up crying my eyes out when I hung up. We have been good now for months. We're past all that mess that went on last summer and into the fall. We're friends, and that's what it is. Hi.
Hi, what are you doing?
Oh, just sitting here doing a lot of nothing.
Yeah, me too. There ain't shit to do around here.
I know.
So, this is work a child, or a library,
Yeah, well,
or a visit.
has your mom and dad been there? Or your mom anyway?
No.
She
They
hasn't.
can't walk.
I know. Last time I was with her, I thought, boy, I don't know how she can make it in the prison like that.
Yeah.
Time is coming. She won't have to do it.
Yeah.
Kathleen, work faster.
Yeah.
Kathleen is doing an absolute wonderful job. I don't think she could do any better. In fact, she's even better than we thought she was. I mean, she leaves no stone unturned, and I love it. But I'm sure that the state isn't going to lie down and die. They're going to fight just like what's happened with Brendan. And in the end, Kathleen's going to win. I swear she is. But when is another story. I think it's going to take a lot longer than what Stephen thinks.
I got Earl out there. He's helping the most, with Mom and Dad. So that puts a little pressure off of me.
You're only supposed to take half of your insulin.
Yeah, I know.
That's it.
That's it?
Yeah, that's the only thing.
No pill?
Well, yeah, you gotta take your pills.
Got to.
Huh?
Read that on there.
Yeah, I told Earl, I said, you're responsible. You help them, give them what they
Can I
need.
make a comment here, Jeff?
You know, make sure mom got.
I'm a diabetic myself, and I know the amount of effort one takes to look after oneself. And I just want to make the comment that it's very sad that Mama Avery is clearly not looking after herself. She's extremely preoccupied with her son and also her nephew, a grandson. And it's terrible because you can actually see it physically on her face. It's taken a toll. You could tell she's not looking after herself as a diabetic. Very, very sad to see.
Got her pills and all of that.
This one you gotta take a third.
Her shots.
The other one, you gotta take a 6.
This one, huh? Or that one?
Same day surgery, ain't it? Or do you get to stay there tonight?
Huh?
You don't get to stay there tonight, do you?
I hope not.
Oh, you don't know?
6 hours, I think I'm supposed to stay there
Yeah.
before I can walk.
And what'd they tell you? Did they say they were gonna just clean the veins out, or they were gonna put plastic veins in?
Just clean them out, I think.
Oh.
So they're opened up.
Huh?
So they're opened up, I think.
That's gonna be a change then. You might be able to do something then after that.
Like what?
Well, you walk. You take everything now tonight, all the same as normal.
Do I have to take these at
You
night?
gotta take your 8 for supper.
Oh, my 8 out of this one.
Well,
You must have filled that up. Such as.
let me see this. You take it again, mother. You didn't take last night's pills?
I don't know, did I? It was Wednesday yesterday.
Yeah, well, you didn't take your last night pills then again.
Maybe I. That's
Don't
'cause I
take
went-
them again now. But leave them in there then. I don't want to come back on next week and they'd be gone.
I won't. I voted these then.
No. Yeah, tonight you take Thursday. It's Thursday today.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think she's losing it. You know, I mean, her memory and everything. And Stevie's got a lot to do with it. You know. So I don't know what's gonna happen.
Is that the first time we've actually seen a picture of Alan in the phase 2? Because it just you can just see how much he's aged, how much weight he's lost, the sort of look, the desperate look on his face, and just the knowledge of what this wrongful conviction has done to his wife, his son, and his whole
Well,
family.
this burden, absolutely. You know, worry and blood pressure issues. It's the silent killer, and it's got that name for a reason, because it, you know, you're constantly, you know, you got these thoughts going on in your mind, and that creates other, you know, reactions within the body, and it weighs on you. And I've seen this with so many people in my life, and the toll that this case, you know, with Brendan and Stephen, the toll it took on Alan, and of course Dolores. You know, she, as Doc has said, she wasn't taking care of herself, and she's diabetic. and what this does to you as a person, your physical health.
Yep. And I think it's important, guys, because it highlights the fact that even though Stephen and Brendan are in prison, the whole family actually is in prison as well. That they're not free.
That's right.
The defendant tells us that Stephen Avery opened the hood of that vehicle. How do we know? Well, based on that statement on March 1st, they swabbed the hood and obtained a DNA profile on that hood, a DNA profile of Stephen Avery. Only the killer and his accomplice would know that.
Well, before Big Jeff smashes his wife's computer, I mean, this is the typical bullshit logic of Tom Fallon, and he did this right throughout Brendan's trial. The reality is they had nothing on Brendan, right? So they have to invent stuff. Now, let's think about this very, very carefully. Brendan Dassey never mentioned Stephen Avery going under a hood, ever. That suggestion is made by Tom Fassbender. And the reason why that suggestion was made by Tom Fassbender is because they knew that the battery terminals had been disconnected underneath the hood. So what Fassbender was trying to allude to and get Brendan Dassey to confess was, yeah, my uncle went under and disconnected the battery terminals, right? But Brendan Dassey never said that, right? Now, think about it. Brendan was meant to have been with Stephen. So hence, Brendan would have known exactly what his uncle did at the RAV, to the RAV at the pit. Clearly, Brendan had no idea what his uncle did because it never happened. It never happened. So here we have Fallon saying, oh, only the killer and his accomplice would know. That's complete utter bullshit, because the suggestion about Stephen going under the hood was not done voluntarily by Brendan. It was actually suggested by Tom. It was suggested by Tom Fassbender, exactly as Mark Wiegert had alluded to about who shot her in the head. So Fallon actually needs to read the reports before he makes crap and bullshit statements like this in front of a judge, in front of a jury, and in front of Teresa's parents. That's simply disgusting.
He says it's like it's some type of revelation, right? Fassbender suggests, what did he do under the hood? How many? And they force him for an answer. How many things can you come up with, right? That he would do in a particular situation, right? They're forcing Brendan into this narrative. What's Brendan going to say? He changed the spark plugs.
He's replacing the transmission.
Yeah, what the hell is he going to say? It's besides that. Is there anything
battery
more obvious than the goddamn battery? Give us a break. Only the kill. Everybody knew that the battery had been disconnected, but you can see the photos of the RAV in the Wisconsin crime lab of the RAV with the hood up. Sherry Culhane put the key in the car and turned it. Nothing happened. Well, they had to check out why. Was the battery dead? No, it turned out the battery was disconnected. How many people opened that damn hood? And secondly, the way he says, oh yeah, that led to the hood latch swab. Did he give you any indication that the hood latch swab was actually taken a month after the coerced confession? A full month. Why'd they wait so long?
Yeah, it's actually worse than that, Big Jeff. I worked out that it's 149 days after the fact. So these dickheads in the crime lab, right? They're so-called crack hotshot crime scene gurus, did not immediately swab the latch, nor anywhere underneath the hood until Brendan's so-called coerced confession. So in other words, they did not process the RAV properly from day one. And all of a sudden, we are to believe that 149 days later, a miraculous swab appears out of nowhere that, wait for it, only has Stephen Avery's genomic DNA on that swab. It's Big Jeff, it's another miracle.
A man
It's
miracle.
another one.
Right. So they knew, right? Because if the battery cables are off, how did they get off? Only under their scenario, only the killer could have done it. They had this knowledge on November 7th or November 6th, 7th, or 8th. Very, very quickly they knew the battery terminals were disconnected. And it must have been the killer that did it because Paul Rabbis didn't do it. Nobody could get into the car in the salvage yard. So the batteries was disconnected right before the RAV was found. Only the killer could have done it. So they knew that it had to happen. Did that prompt them to swab the hood latch then? No. They had to wait for the excuse of this coerced confession to be able to do it. They could have done it at any time. They should have known the killer touched it. They had every reason to swab it prior to Brendan's confession because only the killer could have done it. Why didn't they do it? Obviously.
And it gets worse than that, Big Jeff, because remember, Culhane was asked, well, Stephen Avery was meant to be actively bleeding, right? Yes, sir. Did you notice any blood anywhere underneath the hood? No, right? I don't even believe they did presumptive testing. So it really is, this is a classic example of reverse engineering an event that took place 149 days later. And what's shocking is that the way Fallon is trying to justify why it was the right thing now to swab that hood latch, because according to him, that's a piece of information that only the killer and his accomplice would know, which is, complete utter bullshit.
Look there, because law enforcement had not looked there before. And not until he told them to is when they found this. Well, they suggested to him that he went under a hood. Well, let's take their argument at face value. My response is, so what? They went and they swabbed the hood, and geez.
Did you hear? So
great legal argument, isn't it? So what?
Yeah.
Taught at Marquette Law. So what?
I still don't understand what the fuck he's talking about.
Geez, guess what? Stephen Avery's DNA is on that hood.
It was on the swab anyways.
But they asked the technician who actually went under the hood for the very first time in the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. And they said, now you went under the hood. Yes, sir. Did you actually change your gloves? And you know what he said? No.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
Gloves. So we all know about contact DNA, right? So if he was anywhere around the source of the blood in that RAV4 and he accidentally touched anywhere around where the blood spots were, potentially he could have transferred some DNA from his fingertips on the gloves actually inside the hood. So he could have contaminated the actual hood. And again, it goes to show the sloppy nature of the investigation that was done. And further, my final point is this. He was asked, well, did you actually swab the little latch inside the RAV4 that you have to flick open in order to turn on, in order to unlatch the hood? And you know what he said? No, no, he didn't even swab that. So we have this miraculous jumping of Stephen Avery's genomic DNA from inside the RAV4 to on the hood latch. Truly remarkable, guys.
It's also worth mentioning that he didn't swab the hood prop either. So that's the first thing you do. Once you pop the hood open, you take the prop arm up and put it over on whichever side that it goes on, left or right.
And it's also where was Stephen's Grand Am? I know that when they first brought it in, you can listen to a call with Pagel. They were originally going to store the RAV4 and the Grand Am together, and Pagel said, no, we have to have them separate. But they were close. So is it possible this guy who didn't change his gloves was somewhere near the Grand Am prior to not changing his gloves and going under the hood?
I mean, they had limited, I know the Madison Crime Lab's not tiny, but I'm sure that their base for holding automobiles was not a, conglomerate either. So it had to be, I would think even if they weren't side by side, I think it had to be nearby.
Yep. And the chance of any form of cross-contamination in a situation like that is extremely high. Ideally, you don't want to be anywhere near those two vehicles. And what makes matters worse, guys, is that the same laboratory analyst, Cherie Cohane, swabbed both vehicles.
That's right.
That's a big no-no.
They should have sent one to the Milwaukee Crime Lab and the other one to Madison. That way, there's no chance of cross-contamination.
And also do a double-blind study so
That
no
too.
one knows where the swabs came from.
That's right.
I requested in the motion for scientific testing that we be allowed to do source testing that was developed at Dr. Reich's laboratory. So we picked up the hood latch swab from the Attorney General, and then Dr. Reich did that testing at his laboratory.
In the forensic world, there's only 4 body fluids. We can test for blood, saliva, semen, or urine. And so we made an extract from the fraction of the swab we were provided and did 4 individual tests, and all of those tests were negative.
The saliva test was negative. It's not saliva that was put on the hood latch. So then I wanted to do microtrace testing. When
Jeff,
it was tested,
the importance of the no presence of saliva means that it wasn't a buccal swab that was used. Okay, so that's important to realize that if you're going to plant that DNA on that hood latch, it wasn't from a buccal swab, because that would have had salivary amylase, because your mouth actually produces an enzyme called a salivary amylase, and that's what they would have been detecting quite clearly. Since it was negative for saliva, it means that it wasn't a buccal swab. That's an important point.
by a microtrace chemist, he confirmed that it was completely dissimilar to hood latch swabs that he gathered for purposes of comparison. His sample that was actually taken from a hood latch of a car of similar vintage, there were dark marks on it, and there was absolutely nothing like that on the Avery hood latch swab.
After you have hypothesized that maybe an item of evidence has been improved or manipulated, the question is, how is that done? And we've discussed how you can physically do it, but another way is to relabel an existing item. So from the unknown parts of the case, they are going to get profiles. Whose profile is it? So you need to get a standard, you need a reference. And so there are reference standards from the defendant. And then there's the actual evidence samples from the crime scene. Most of the samples are swabs. Suppose in a case that one of the reference swabs doesn't make it into the proper envelope. And now you relabel that swab, evidence number 4. So now you've identified the defendant on an item of evidence by simply changing the name on the swab. You haven't physically manipulated anything, you've just changed the name. That's very simple to do. Now you have to have the extra item, you have to lose it in the system, but that happens in cases.
So we started looking for other swabs that might have been substituted for the hood latch swabs. And lo and behold, we found that when Stephen Avery was first taken into custody, he was taken to a hospital and swabs were gathered from his body. 2 groin swabs were taken from Stephen Avery. Wiegert and Fassbender had a search warrant The nurse took the groin swabs, and then one of them said, oh, the warrant doesn't call for us to take groin swabs. And they documented that the nurse threw them into a receptacle. The nurse, though, did not document that they'd been taken. So immediately, you know something's wrong. I think that they kept the swabs. So I wanted to investigate the chain of custody on the so-called hood latch swab that was given to the crime lab. The officers that photographed and swabbed the hood latch, Tyson and Hawkins, did not turn the swab over to the crime lab. Wiegert did. But when Wiegert turned it over, in the custody transmittal sheet, he signed Hawkins' name. There may be
Boom, gotcha. That's pretty good work, actually. I had to give it up to her for that. She followed the evidence, and she put together a pretty decent little compelling theory that, I mean, I don't think we've seen it argued in court, but I do like how she's put the pieces together.
Well, the common factor here, the common person here, is Mark Wiegert, right? So Mark Wiegert was where Stephen Avery was when the nurse. Now, by the way, that the Fritsch nurse was a sane nurse, so she was basically getting evidence from Stephen Avery, or as though he had committed a sexual offence. That's why she took the groin swabs, right? But that wasn't part of the search warrant. But obviously no one, Mark Wiegert and Tom Fassbender obviously said to her, look, we only want you to take a buccal swab. And what's important here is that no blood was drawn from Stephen Avery. Only a buccal swab was taken. So somebody forgot to tell Nurse Fritsch that, hey, he's not being examined for a sexual assault here. He's just taking a buccal swab. Remember, he was arrested for felon in possession of a weapon, right? He wasn't arrested for the murder of Teresa Horbach. He was there to get a DNA standard, a buccal swab. Now, here's the importance of this evidence here. The last person to sign that sheet, or the person who got in custody of the so-called hood latch swab, was none other than Mark Wiegert. So Mark Wiegert had a strategic role in two different places. The place where Stephen got the groin swabs and handing in the swab, the so-called hood latch swab. And notice, he didn't sign his name, he signed somebody else's name. That to me is highly suspicious. And the other thing is, a groin swab is not going to have saliva, it's going to have skin epithelial cells. And what did the test show? The absence of saliva. Boom.
two other investigators, Hawkins, Tyson, that photographed and swabbed the hood latch. But I don't believe that swab ever made its way to the Wisconsin crime lab. I think Wiegert substituted the groin swab. And then that swab would have a robust amount of DNA on it. Of course, it never touched a hood latch. It never was in the vicinity of the RAV4. They just renamed the swab.
And you know what makes matters worse? Mark Wiegert cannot disprove it. He cannot disprove it. And I would like to know what Kellie has to say about that, because this is very important, right? There's no test for planting. I'd like to hear Mark Wiegert's explanation of what he's doing at two different places. One, where Stephen got the groin swab done. He was there. And secondly, his handling of the hood latch swab. Now, remember, they want to ensure a conviction. They want to ensure that Stephen does not walk out on a technicality. They want to ensure that he goes to prison for this. So I'm telling you right now, this will not be the very first case in which detectives or investigators have tampered with crime scene evidence, right? Kofa did it. Remember Jack 61? Kofa did it.
Yep.
He planted blood in 2 different murder trials, not just one, and he went to prison for evidence tampering. So you would be naive to think that Mark Wiggett wouldn't try a stunt like this. You see, it's a swab. No one would know except by doing some fact checking. Kathleen Zona caught it out.
Even the Hudson case there, it's in not that far away in Wisconsin. Kenneth Hudson, they screwed that kid over, like royally screwed that guy.
Right, just the time frame of it is part of what stinks, as we were talking about before. Like, they showed the calendar date. It appears as though the swab happened April 1st, right? A full month after Brendan's confession on March 1st. Why? Right? Why did it take so long for them to do that? They couldn't think of it. It's, oh yeah, I have an idea how we could use this thing that we came upon. Kathleen's theory is brilliant. It's like, okay, we're looking to pile it on. We want to make sure this conviction happens. Hey, we got this swab. I can see a good place to put it to use. You know, and it actually fits. What doesn't fit is the law enforcement timeline of waiting till April 1st to do that swab. Biological material degrades. The longer you wait, the less of a chance you have. But bam, look at the size of this swab that we got.
Yeah. So if you want to take a sample from, say, a hood latch, you must always wet the swab. You don't use a dry swab. You basically wet it. You can either use either a sterile solution. It's a sterile solution. It could either be a distilled water, or it could be a salt solution, whatever. The whole purpose is to wet the swab, so when you rub the hood latch, you extract the DNA or the cells which are present on that surface. So you don't dry rub it, use a solution for the purpose of gathering up if there's any cells which are present.
So I mean, further apologize for the interrogation, but the hood latch itself, you know, the amount that's exposed when you release the, when you release the lever, it probably pops up a couple, inches or so, and then you reach your hand in, and you can get a couple of fingers on that to be able to sort of pull it over, right? So, it's a good inch, maybe inch and a half or something like that. Is when you take that swab, that wet Q-tip looking swab, do you sort of rub it up and down the full length of that, or do you just take one spot? And what would be the correct way to do that?
No, what you would do is you would swab the entire hood latch, the whole structure. So, in other words,
and would you be spinning the thing as you did it to make sure, or would you just take it out?
No, you can. You can. So basically what you want to do is sometimes you may take more than one sample, but normally you just take the one. So you pre-wet the swab and then you swipe it across the hood latch and you give it a good rub to ensure that you've taken material from that hood latch. Correct.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that's just an excuse for making it more and more dirty. The more of that latch you're going to cover, the more grease and grime you're going to wipe off. That thing should be filthy.
Yes. And what we've seen is that Dr. Palahniuk took some exemplar samples, or Kathleen Zona did, and you can actually see the grease mark on the hood latch swab, on the exemplar hood latch swab. And that's what you would normally find, because remember, your hood latch is exposed to the elements. Your car's driving on the road, there'll be grease, grime, you name it. The only time you're going to get a hood latch that's perfectly clean is if the hood latch itself is brand new, never been driven.
I was just going to kind of go back to what Dr. Siltman was saying in terms of the hood latch and Kathleen Zellner and, her expert and what they kind of opined to. On page 446 of her latest reply to the state, that's actually probably one of the only parts of law enforcement that she doesn't rule out. She actually keeps that in. So she's quite, to me, she's quite confident that what she found in terms of the hood latch and the hospital and the groin swab may have an actual influence on the outcome, because it's one of the aspects that she's holding on to. She mentions it again. She goes through in the first few pages, like how Bobby Dassey allegedly could have had potentially, planted the blood in the RAV, was pushing the RAV, and had all these other methods of all the other planting. But when she gets to the hood latch, she does still include that Mark Wiegert had that opportunity to do that planting. And I think the baseline of that is purely because the blood in the RAV, I think, has always been such a strong focal point of the case. It's one of those things that you cannot explain. It's because, like Dr. Silkman said, you can't prove planting. There's no testing for planting. But it's almost like they kept getting greedy. They knew that. They wanted more. So when they got to the point that they had Brendan say that they went under the hood latch and the whole timeline of the battery, and we all know that that's just bollocks. But anyway, for me, it's because they wanted to just really drive it home. They wanted something more powerful than blood. And how could you prove that cells are there when they shouldn't be? And I think that was basically, in the nutshell, their motive. They just wanted more. They were worried that if you broke, like what Kathleen does, when you break down each piece of evidence individually, you can poke holes in all of it. And so they just wanted that extra. So if the defense team could get past the blood and satisfy that they didn't think, satisfied to the jury back then that the blood was planted, then the next obstacle was, okay, then how would they have planted this side of it? So that's just kind of my summary of that side. And thanks for asking me my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to remember here, if you guys can help me. Didn't they try to get Kucharski to say that he found the key or put the key on his report when in fact it wasn't him that found the key?
Yes.
Which is a very similar circumstance to this.
Yes. That they had to. But basically, if you read I think it's the case report, Kucharski's name is mentioned. Correct. They wanted to distance that finding of the key by Lincoln Colburn for obvious reasons. And just a quick point, 100% agree with Kellie. The blood in the RAV4 was not enough. They needed a secondary biological material from pointing to Stephen Avery. So hence, you now had, the state had multiple points to make in terms of the forensic evidence pointing to Stephen. Not only was it his blood, but it also was his skin cells. And hence, that's why Mr. Kratz kept on saying sweat DNA. And remember, he laughed about the fact that now police officers were walking around with not only vials of blood from Stephen, but also buckets of sweat. So that's why they needed a second forensic evidence, or a lot of forensic evidence against Stephen. They needed another biological molecule, and that was his skin cells.
Well. That does us for I think another episode, guys. That was quite the discussion, and we covered a lot. It feels like a long time ago that we were talking about Ken Kratz in front of the cameras. So I guess that's time that we throw it over to Big Jeff for a wrap up. So the floor is yours, Big Jeff. Wrap us up.
Thanks, Jeff, for doing that. I mean, I definitely agree that the podcast started off on a low note with Mr. Kratz, joking very inappropriately about how he did the state of Wisconsin and the entire country a public service by breaking it to us easy, the horrific details of the case, keeping some of the more real, particularly horrific ones to himself. what disgusting joke he is, and I'm glad we didn't see him for the rest of the time. Always heartbreaking to talk about Brendan and Felon Fallon's actually ridiculous summary of how Brendan's confession led to the hood latch swab with a so what in there, and you're just by his own statements condemning the incompetence of the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. And it was good to see, at the end, Kathleen Zellner hard at work. I'd completely forgotten about the sort of I want to call it forensic information, that she did tracking the signatures, not the same type of forensics we're used to with our good friend Dr. Silkman talking about them, but kind of forensic analysis of tracking that, and her at work. I mean, she is no dummy, and she honestly believes in her heart of hearts that Stephen Avery's innocent, and Brendan as well. And when just somebody with that level of intelligence and is putting not only her mouth but her money where her mouth is on this topic, you just have to wonder if you're on the guilty side. Am I really making the right call? She's no dummy. She's looked at this very hard. As of all the people on the panel and probably most of the people in the chat, we've all come to the same conclusion, that there was a lot of shenanigans that went on here. And it was good to end the episode with Kathleen and her experts right in the middle of just eviscerating more of the state's case. So that's good to see, and it's a lot of this process that puts us in the place where we are on the truther or guilty side. So with that, I'll hand it off to the next.
Absolutely, Big Jeff. Really appreciate that. And I think Dr. Silkman was mentioned in your little summation there, so it would only be appropriate to go to Dr. Silkman next.
I really enjoyed this episode, although we didn't cover really that much. But for me, the take-home messages is how much of a scumbag Mr. Kratz is, for him trying to justify why he did the March 2nd press conference. Just complete garbage. The other take-home messages for me was the horrible, horrendous effect on both Ma and Pa Avery. The trial really did them in. The arrest of their son and their grandson was just a shocking domino effect on their own health. You can actually physically see the deterioration in both Ma and Pa Avery. It had a truly terrible effect. I also want to champion how much of a fantastic person Sandy Greenman is. She really has stood by Stephen through good times and bad times. Stephen has a lot to thank her for her tenacious ability. And finally, I really enjoyed the forensic aspects of this case. I must admit, this is an area where I really like to focus on. I like to focus on the forensics and what it tells us. And it's pretty amazing when someone like Dr. Reich spells it out very cleanly and easily how it is to manipulate forensic scientific evidence. Yeah, very, very shocking. On to the next, guys. That was a really enjoyable episode.
Thank you, Dr. Silkman. Appreciate those comments. Jack, it's your turn for your summation today.
I do want to leave everyone with this thought, though, because we talked about it a little bit in all this. And this is about the forensics and the DNA and these samples that got sent to the FBI. And I'm talking about specifically from the RAB. And again, we touched on this some. I'm sure it'll come up again. If you think about, I think in normal course of business, the FBI takes their own fucking samples, pardon my French. And in this case, they did not. They relied on what Sherry Colleen sent them. She could have sent them moon rocks. They had no, I'm sorry, I know this says, well, you're just creating some freaking conspiracy. I'm really not. She could have sent them anything she wanted. She controlled all the samples. I just want to leave that thought with everyone, since we're talking, we're talking about hood latch, swabs, and all these other various things. So I'm going to leave it there. Great summary by Doc and Big Jeff. I'll let Kel finish this up.
Absolutely, Jack. Thank you. And Cal, of course, it's your turn to lead us out of episode 28.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen, for your summaries and for the knowledge that you guys brought into this panel today. For me, I'm actually at that point that I'm so exhausted from even talking about canker rats. That's why I'm not saying anything. I'm purely over it. I'm at that point that I think with a narcissist, the way you beat them is you don't give them what they want, and that's attention. Secondly, on terms of the forensic side that Jay Jack just kind of brought up, I get there's an ideal of this case out there in the community that this case was somewhat circumstantial. I don't actually believe that. I think that there was definitely circumstantial aspects of the case, but it was very much based on the forensics. And that is why, in my opinion, the planting of the forensics was so important to law enforcement. It was that's their conviction. If they would have went there with nothing, if they didn't have the hood latch, they didn't have the blood in the RAV, if they didn't have the planted key with the excessive amount of DNA on that key, they would have presented, all they would have had was that circumstantial element of she came that day, she may or may not have been, that might have been her last stop, and it kind of built around that. But they hang on to that forensic side of it because that is what, in my opinion, brought them home. I don't think the jury, especially hearing that it started with what was the final count? Wasn't it like 9 innocent, 2 guilty, or 3 guilty and 1 undecided at the first straw man count kind of thing at the end?
I think it was seven not guilty.
Sorry, seven not guilty yet. And I although I was not in that room and I'll never know what happened in that room, but if you think logically, the people that were so for the guilt of Stephen, what would have been their strength and do you think they would have pushed home the most? And that for me would have been the forensic side of the case. They would have just kept saying, but the blood in the RAV, or the DNA on the hood latch, they were under there. That's what would have, in my opinion, would have been the driving force. And that's what makes this case not circumstantial. It makes it based on forensic. And that is the hardest thing to undo, because exactly what Dr. Silkman said throughout this is there is no test for planting. And who knew that more than anyone? I'll let you guys answer that yourselves. Thank you for everyone in chat, and I'll see you guys next episode.
Well, thank you, Kelly, for that wrap up. We waited a little bit once we get that motor running, we really get a lot of great content out of you for sure, Cal. Really appreciate that. Can't wait for next week when we hear more from Cal and the rest of the groups. So for Big Jeff, Dr. Silkman, Jack, and Cal, this is Jeff Jones saying this has been Discussing a Murderer.